Canada will join the European Defence Fund. It means Canadian defence firms will have access to both funds and expertise to develop their lines of business.
Canada-EU or EU-Canada Strategic Partnership for the Future will build a new and deeper relationship that brings us closer together, from defence to digital, from supply chains to security.
This will allow Canada, for example, to participate by supplying capabilities such as ammunition, missiles, drones, artillery systems, infantry weapons, and beyond. So the opportunities for Canada.
This is not a news alert, and it is not a routine defence update. What is unfolding here is a structural recalibration of how Canada positions itself in the global power system. Canada's decision to formally conclude negotiations to participate in the European Union's Security Action for Europe programme, known as SAFE, represents a deliberate and long-term strategic shift. This move is not symbolic, and it is not designed for short-term political signalling. It reflects a deeper recognition inside Ottawa that national security, industrial resilience, and strategic autonomy can no longer rest on a single external framework. For decades, Canada's defence and industrial posture was shaped within a narrow set of assumptions. The United States was not only Canada's closest ally, but also the primary gateway through which defence cooperation, supply chains, and advanced manufacturing flowed. Access to markets, technologies, and joint programs was overwhelmingly tied to American systems. In theory, this relationship was framed as partnership. In practice, it created dependency. Canadian defence firms operated inside US-controlled supply chains where export licenses, regulatory approvals and technology sharing were subject to Washington's political and strategic priorities. When those priorities aligned with Canadian interests, the system functioned smoothly. When they did not, Canadian companies absorbed the consequences. Delays, sudden restrictions, and policy reversals were not exceptions. They were structural features of the system. Over time, this dependence became more exposed. Trade disputes increasingly spilled into security cooperation. Tariffs appeared in sectors once assumed to be insulated from political pressure. Procurement rules hardened under domestic-first frameworks that reduced flexibility for allied partners. Defence access, once treated as a shared strategic necessity, began to function as leverage, sometimes linked to unrelated trade or political demands. SAFE alters this structural reality. Participation in the EU's Security Action for Europe programme gives Canada direct access to European defence procurement, joint manufacturing initiatives, and collaborative innovation funding that operates under a different institutional logic. This access is not filtered through Washington. It is governed by multinational frameworks designed to balance national interests rather than centralise control. This matters because it diversifies Canada's strategic options. Under SAFE, Canadian companies in aerospace, cybersecurity, naval systems, and advanced manufacturing can integrate into European defence ecosystems that emphasise interoperability and shared standards. These systems are less exposed to abrupt policy swings driven by domestic political cycles. For Canadian firms, this translates into stability. For policymakers, it creates planning certainty. For workers and investors, it reduces exposure to geopolitical shock. Importantly, this shift is not about choosing Europe over the United States. It is about ensuring that Canada is no longer structurally constrained by a single gatekeeper. When access runs through only one system, pressure becomes effective. When alternatives exist, leverage weakens. This is where the strategic meaning of SAFE becomes clear. Midway through this recalibration, the focus moves beyond Europe itself. The central issue is not geography, but power dynamics. When Canada has real options, external pressure loses its ability to dictate outcomes. Dependency narrows choices. Diversification expands them. For years, US policymakers operated on the assumption that Canadian alignment was automatic, not because of coercion, but because Canada had limited alternatives. SAFE quietly challenges that assumption. It does not confront it publicly, it renders it outdated. With access to European defence markets and collaborative frameworks, Canada's negotiating position changes. Cooperation becomes reciprocal rather than expected. Alignment becomes conditional rather than automatic. This does not undermine alliances, it stabilizes them by restoring balance. Another critical dimension of SAFE lies in innovation control. Under US-centric systems, Canadian research and development often pass through American approval processes. Technology transfers, joint projects, and manufacturing decisions were subject to export controls and political review. SAFE provides pathways for Canadian innovation to move within a multinational framework that prioritizes shared capability rather than unilateral oversight. This reduces bottlenecks, it shortens development timelines, and it gives Canada greater sovereignty over where and how its defense technologies are developed, produced, and deployed. The timing of this move is not accidental. As US policy becomes more unpredictable, allies are adjusting. America First procurement rules, tariff threats, and transactional security demands have introduced uncertainty into areas once considered stable. Defense, once insulated from trade politics, is no longer immune. SAFE is Canada's response, not confrontational, but corrective. Europe, in contrast, is offering something increasingly scarce: institutional predictability. European defence frameworks are built around long-term planning, shared standards, and collective investment rather than short-term political leverage. For Canada, this predictability is not ideological. It is practical. The message emerging from Ottawa is measured but firm. National security cannot be dependent on another country's domestic political cycles. Long-term defence planning requires insulation from volatility, not assumptions of continuity. This does not mean Canada is turning away from the United States. The US remains a key partner and ally. But it is no longer the only pillar supporting Canada's security and industrial strategy. Europe is now a serious and permanent component of that structure. This reflects a broader shift in Canadian strategic thinking. Sovereignty in the modern era is not defined by isolation. It is defined by flexibility, redundancy, and choice. SAFE aligns Canada with systems that reward collaboration rather than dominance and resilience rather than dependency. In an environment where policy changes can disrupt entire industries overnight, flexibility is power.